we're talking about this book written by Rosaly Puthucheary. Am I saying that right? Yes. About her father's untold story, and any other information is in the book, so I won't spend too much time on it. So we're in this like big auditorium with a decent crowd, which is good because it keeps the intimacy of the event. And I'm looking forward to having a panel of very esteemed people. I received all the biographies of the panelists and the moderator and even the author herself, like yesterday, today, and I do want to apologize in case I don't do it justice, which I probably won't because I can't. But they are definitely a lot better than I will describe them to be. So, yeah, that's the event. We're going to be talking about this book. So we will start with Sanjay, who is, I'm just going to take this, the eldest son of Rosaly, and he is a published poet and a writer himself, and he works in the corporate sector, no, actually maritime sector in the corporate world, and his goal is to make the world a better place through decarbonizing the maritime sector. I don't know what that is, but it sounds really, really cool. You can probably explain. So he's going to start by reading excerpts from the book, and I will learn a lot because I didn't get a chance to read it yet. So.
Thanks, Vidya.
Yeah. Okay.
She obviously pulled that out from LinkedIn. You didn't? Oh, okay. Someone did. Thank you so much. Anyway, thank you all for being here. It's really, we're going to have a fun day, right? So this is not going to be a serious literary criticism kind of stuff. But I love the fact that my mom took the effort to pull this together. More often than not, my generation or even my sons who are here somewhere, in their generation, if we don't codify these things, these stories, it gets lost. And it's really a great thing that Mom had put a lot of effort behind this, the research and talking to people and even letting her imagination, imagining how things would have been for my grandfather. Sorry, take that. So I had the pleasure of reading multiple versions of the manuscript in its production journey, and no matter how many times I read it, I'm always finding a nugget, something new about my family and her father. So I'm going to read a few excerpts which really resonated with me. The first one, and those of you who have the book with you, you can turn to page 39. It's the figure in a sari. This is about my grandmother actually, and in the last decade of her life, my brother and I lived with her. So it's a bit more, I learned more about my grandmother through this book as well, and it really kind of moved me, right? So I'll start. Although Joseph started to hear of the battles in war through a number of his acquaintances, he trusted what was said in the daily newspaper, Singapore Times. Joseph was confident that the British would halt the Japanese advancement. But by then, on the night of the 15th of January, the Japanese had captured a number of barges and used them. By nightfall of the 16th hour, Wartown and the harbour had fallen into Japanese hands. Disappointed with the withdrawal of the British Army, Joseph hired 2 taxis to take his whole family to Amber Estate, where a number of Malayali families had planned to evacuate. Joseph heard of the massacre in Parit Sulong, the beheading of the Indian soldiers who fought on the British side who had been taken prisoners, but he still stayed on in Johor Bahru. With his family safely in Amber Estate, he felt less nervous. A bomb hit the coconut tree that grew in the far end of their garden. The impact of the bomb that hit the medical center, a building next to the house, broke the glassware and pottery at Joseph's house. Eventually, Joseph decided to leave the house with his memories. He thought of his children, picking his way through the shards of glass. He savored the memories of his children, which made him pick up the photos that were smashed during the bombing. He picked up a photo of his 3 girls sitting on the bench. He stared down at the photo, removed the broken glass from the frame, and slipped the picture into his breast pocket. Then he found another photo of Daisy and Rosaline sitting together. They were dressed identically. He remembered seeing them walk behind their sister as flower girls on her wedding day. He managed to save the photo by removing the shards of glass, again slipping the photo into his pocket. As he straightened himself after slipping the photo of his daughters, sitting next to each other in identical dresses, 2 Japanese soldiers walked in. They said, "Come with us." Joseph was dressed to leave, was glad that he did not delay in dressing up. He could hear the sound of bombing that was going on in Singapore and Johor Bahru. As he was marched out of the transport, he noticed another man about his height, also been escorted into the lorry. When he got to the head office of the Kamputai, which was a newly built custom office at the edge of the sea, he was astonished to see the whole custom office swarming with Japanese soldiers with guns. Joseph found himself tied to a lamppost, back to back with another man. Joseph couldn't believe his eyes when he spotted the other person. The other man looked as if he was pulled out of bed and looked disheveled. The lamppost was in an area where everyone could see them. Joseph thought, how did I become a criminal? What have I done? His job was to record criminals. Instead, he has now become a criminal. He was made to stand in the sun with no water for 3 days. All he could do was to think of his 4 little girls. Why do children occupy one's mind when things go wrong? The next day, 2 of the people who were tied to the another lamppost were taken away. He recognized Dr. Luther, a well-known heart specialist, and Dr. Doraisamy, a general practitioner. Dr. Doraisamy was angry and he shouted out abuses in Tamil. In the end, he was silenced by a bullet. Dr. Luther was shot 3 times and Doraisamy once. Joseph wondered how many bullets would they need to kill him here. The partner who was tied up to the lamppost roused himself from the stupor he was in and declared that he was the Sultan. Subsequently, the Sultan was released. Then the Sultan, who saw a friend among the invaders, invited General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the commander of the Japanese army, to Bukit Suri. After standing in the sun for 3 days, he saw in the distance a taxi pulling up at the custom office. Dismounting from the car was a woman in cotton sari. She held the hand of a little boy of 7, carrying a stainless steel tiffin carrier in the other hand. They walked swiftly to the custom office. Joseph was bewildered. Who would have the guts to walk into a place swarming with Japanese soldiers? He watched a figure clad in the sari in the distance. After a while, a Japanese officer came out. He was about 5'3", with a pair of glasses. He spoke good English. The figure sat in the chair next to the table. The officer asked her, "What do you want?" "I want my husband, the father of my 9 children." "Who is he?" "Mr. P.C. Joseph." "What does he do?" "He's the court interpreter." "Not a spy?" "No, not a spy." "Why did he learn Japanese?" "He learned many languages when he was studying at the University of Madras." "Madras?"
So why is he working here? India is full of graduates, so he left. When he came to Malaya, he learned Malay. Then he also learned Chinese. After meeting with Dr. Tanaka, who said if you can learn Chinese, the study of the Japanese language will be easy. With the help of Dr. Tanaka, he learned Japanese. Where do you come from? From the state of Cochin. Why use English name? Joseph is not English, it's biblical, from the Bible. I see. Is he Indian? Yes, my husband comes from the state of Cochin. He is a follower of Gandhi. Gandhi? Why don't you ask him to help you? He can be a good interpreter. All right, we'll look into the matter. What do you have in the tiffin carrier? Just some food for my husband. Who cooked the food? I did. Where do you stay? At Amber Estate. The Japanese officer wrote down the address and stood up. The woman in sari also stood up. They pushed the chairs and walked into another room. The little boy held on to his mother's hand. This bit of information was given to me by my brother Dominic, who's the little boy. Joseph was brought into the room after a good 10 minutes. He saw his wife dressed in the sari he bought for her at birth of the youngest daughter. She looked like an angel dressed in white sari, but he also noticed her concerned face. She brought with her the stainless tiffin carrier. She sat next to him and fed him because he seemed to lack energy or have any desire to feed himself. I'm now going to jump to page 55 just to close up that whole scene. On page 55, yeah. So Joseph was glad to be back with his family in Amber Estate, which belonged to a British company. When the Englishmen left for England with their wives, they left the estate in the care of a Malayali who was a hospital assistant. He invited 8 Malayali families to take refuge in Amber Estate. They were told to bring provisions with them. On arrival, all food like rice, milk, and sugar were heaped together. A collective cooking system was then established. With 9 children and a grandmother, Joseph's family were given the biggest room in the bungalow. Joseph slept at one end, and Kunyum Mahatri slept at the opposite end of the mat. Their 4 daughters slept with them. The night was cool, and there was a bright full moon in the sky. Joseph heard a bird chirp. He thought about life. Does every man need a woman? Kunyum Mahatri? Yes. What did you promise? That you would be an interpreter. Was it easy? You had some guts to walk into a Kempetai headquarters, particularly in your state of pregnancy. What is Kempetai? It's the military police arm of the Imperial Japanese Army. It is the conventional military police and the secret police force in their newly occupied territory. I didn't know that. All I needed to know was that you were in their hands, and I had to intervene to save you. Where did you find the courage? It was an impulsive act. I did not realize how much stress it put on me. What do you mean? When I got back to Amber Estate, I was bleeding. How many months? Only 2 months. You okay now? Yes. It's not to be expected in these tough times. Thank you for saving my life. So Kunyum is actually my grandmother. There's another short paragraph that I want to read as well, and that's on page 51. And I'll start in the middle of the chapter. On the 15th of February 1942, the British decided to surrender to the Japanese. The British group headed by Lieutenant General Percival arrived at the Ford factory on that day. Joseph was escorted by 2 Japanese soldiers to the room where General Yamashita sat opposite Lieutenant General Percival. Joseph was told that his wife had agreed that he would be an interpreter. He listened closely to the exchange between the 2 leaders. Joseph did his best to understand and interpret the conversation between Percival and Yamashita. But when Lieutenant General Percival said that the British agreed to surrender unconditionally, Joseph was shocked. How could this happen, he thought. Did I miss a part of the conversation? In his translation, he did not say the word unconditional. He used the word unequivocal, which sent General Yamashita into a frenzy. He raised his voice and started to abuse him in Japanese. What do you mean? All the while, Joseph kept his eyes on Lieutenant General Percival, trying to understand the reasoning behind the word unconditional. Realizing his mistake, Joseph managed to say the word which quietened down General Yamashita. They had surrendered unconditionally. Later, when all of them retired to the table laid with cuttlefish, chestnuts, and sake, Joseph found that he had no stomach for the feast. By 5:30, the meeting was over. An agreement was reached. 1,000 British troops would be in arms to patrol the streets to prevent rioting and keep the Japanese out of the town area. This spared the people of Singapore from the advances of Japanese fighting forces into the center of the city. He was told that the garrison acceptance of the ceasefire would be signaled with a white flag on top of Cathay Building. As Joseph sat in the car which took him to Amherst Estate, he let his mind go through the ordeal. He said to himself, I can't believe the British would surrender. I wonder why the British lost the fighting spirit. Perhaps it was because they weren't emotionally involved in the country. They may have underestimated the Japanese and overestimated the defensive nature of the jungle. But to surrender unconditionally was indeed a shock. Was I being ironical when I used the word unequivocal instead of unconditional? The fury of Yamashita was not at the British, but at me. I wonder what made me use the wrong word. Was it a mistake? Or was it intentional? I was relieved when he accepted the correction as a genuine mistake on my part. Joseph thought, I hope the Japanese would be better imperialists than the British. As he listened to the evening news, he heard Sir Shenton Thomas' surrender speech. Shenton urged the people of Singapore to cooperate with the enemy for their own safety. Did I collaborate? Or was I just a cooperative? The phrase went through his mind as he tried to doze off. The question bothered him, and he kept his mind alert. Would I be termed as a collaborator? What does it matter? According to the dictionary, the word collaborator means someone who cooperates with the enemy invader, whereas the word cooperate means someone who is prepared to work together for a common purpose. How does this differ? When Sir Shenton Thomas said, the people should cooperate with the enemy for their own safety, did he mean collaborate or cooperate? He dozed off trying to understand the subtleties of the English language and speech. He woke up with a start and thought learning Japanese was made possible of Dr. Tanaka. If I hadn't met him, I wouldn't have mastered the complex language. The kanji script is simple enough, but I had to learn the script. If Dr. Tanaka hadn't pointed out the difference between the kanji script and the Japanese syllabic script, hiragana and katakana, it would have been taken me years to learn the Japanese language. Kanji script make learning of Jawi simple. Joseph thought, I have learned to read Malayalam script and Tamil script and Urdu script and Jawi script and Japanese script and Latin alphabet. While learning to read Latin, I thought it was difficult. Now with the discipline I acquired in learning Latin has become useful. Latin is highly organized and logical language. It sharpens the mind and cultivates mental alertness. It creates in the learner an intense attention to detail and develops critical thinking. Most importantly, it makes the learner reflect various ways to say the same thing. In fact, it provides a blueprint for any language that one may be learning later in life. I thought to read these passages to give you a flavor of the characters, the key characters in the book through these excerpts, and I hope that you'll get even more from the panel discussion later, led by my dearest brother, younger brother, Sharad. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the reading and you enjoyed the
Thank you for the reading. It was I always find it very engaging when people read chapters from a book because it's like reading together, you know. So good. That was very. I was very. Well, I don't know if moved is the word, but I enjoyed it. Okay. What I should have done earlier, which I didn't do because I'm not professional at this, and I've been told this is a very chill atmosphere, so I should have given an overview of what the day is going to be like, which I didn't do. So we were going to start with our reading, and which is already done, and then we will have the panel discussion, and after we are networking, getting to know each other better, and book signing, and then, you know, food, and I don't know about that part. There's definitely tea. Okay, so this, I will start by introducing the moderator of the panel discussion, who is Sharad Kuttan. Right? So Sharad is a journalist who has worked in print and broadcast. And you currently host 2 talk shows. One is Let's Talk with Sharad Kuttan, and the other is Consider This. I'm a very big fan of talk shows, so that sounded really cool. And while you were pursuing your postgraduate degree in sociology, you were also the co-editor of the NUS Society's journal Commentary. And one issue got published as a collection of essays. All in all, well, you were also awarded the Nippon Foundation's Asian Public Intellectual Fellowship. It's a lot of words. But, yeah, so this is a lot of words, and I'm sure you've done a lot more things, but, you know, that's where all my information ends. Okay, and then next I want to introduce the author of the book herself, Rosaly. And like in her book, she writes that she's written this book based off of memories, and it might be misrepresented. I read that in the forward quickly. I might also do a terrible job at this, but I will try. So you started writing poetry she started writing in her teens, which is admirable because I can't write poetry. And one of her first poems got published in 1952. And then you got a scholarship. She got a scholarship to study at the Malayan Teachers Training College. So you're trained to be a teacher, trained as a teacher. And she had a brief stint where she went back to JB to teach arts and crafts. I would have loved to have an art teacher like you. That would have made me stick with it, which I didn't. And so, yeah, she did that, and then she left teaching. She studied in NUS, and poems got published. You then went back to teaching. You went back to teaching in 1972 at RGS, the Raffles Secondary School, where you taught English literature. You also taught at Anglo-Chinese Junior College. And then eventually, if all of this was not enough, you then retired in 2001. And you went back to NUS, and you have a Doctor of Philosophy. Congratulations. Okay, yeah, that's the information that I had, which I hope is accurate. I will then introduce, I suppose I can introduce Dr. Anita, sorry, if we're going this way. She's an applied linguist, which I actually don't know what that means, but it sounds really cool. An author and a poet. This is a very esteemed, I'm a little bit nervous because they're all very esteemed people who have accomplished a lot of things. And so I'm trying to, elevate this, but, hopefully. Okay, so she is an academic at the National Institute of Education at the Nanyang Technological University, where she teaches courses on literacy practices, writing pedagogy, and creative writing. And she also holds the position of a research fellow with the Indian Heritage Center and serves on the board of the Indian Community Oral History Committee, as well as the Publications Consultative Panel, that's a lot of words, of Ministry of Communications and Information. So all in all, her area of research is focusing on the Malayali community in Singapore, on which she has given lots of talks on this topic, I guess to bring light. So she won a grant with the National Heritage Board to study the ethnic heritage of the community, the Malayali community here. And she's published a lot of books, a lot of publications, notably one called From Kerala to Singapore, Voices from the Singapore Malayali Community. And I think it's very interesting because, side note, my grandparents also immigrated to Singapore from Kerala, so I feel like I also learn a lot from these kinds of events. And she's an avid lover of poetry, which is a great thing to have in this event. Yes, and actually even better, some of her poems are taught in schools, not just in Singapore, but also in Philippines, India, and Australia. So, that's an extensive, introduction. I will now move to the next, not least. Vishwa Sadasivan. I feel very awkward. I always call him Uncle Vishwa because I know him, so not out of disrespect.
I call him Uncle.
I actually call him Uncle Casey, so.
This is not a competition.
No, it's not. It's just that I feel I have to say like these things are not because I lack respect, but it's just okay. Never mind. Okay, so with Uncle Casey, I'm just gonna stick with that. He is a very respected thinker and socio-political commentator in Singapore. And what is great is that he is he has over 35 years of experience in media, and especially with panel events. So he's on a panelist and a speaker, both in Singapore and also abroad. So he has a lot of experience in moderating, but also being on a panel. And so for the past 25 years, he's been a corporate strategy consultant at Strategic Moves. If I'm correct, yes. Yes, and politically speaking, he was a nominated member of parliament. No, yes. And he's served on several public and private sector boards, and as well as national committees such as the Economic Review Committee. He's also a very, very sought after commercial mediator, and he's been in this profession for the last 25 years. He's also on the board of the Singapore International Mediation Center. Yes. And recently in 2005, he launched Inconvenient Questions, which is a video online, I suppose, the discussion on topics that would be otherwise heavily debated. And I've attended some of them, and what is great about it is that it allows for the discussion of otherwise difficult subjects that people are a little bit hesitant to talk about. And so he launched that, an online discussion, like an interview program. And it now has, it's now international. It's international. It's been picked up by a German radio station. So he has a lot of experience in that. And also moderated over 300 forums, locally and globally. And he's also served 45 years as a national service officer with the Singapore Armed Forces as a colonel. And his last held appointment was Deputy Director of Joint Operations. Yes. That was very long, I'm so sorry. Everyone knows your entire life story now. I'm very, very sorry. This is very long. But, okay, please continue with the panel discussion.
Thanks, Vidya, for that extended introduction to all of us. The way this is going to work is I'm going to ask Uncle Biswa and Anita to begin the discussion with their general impressions of the book, and also a question that they want to ask Rosaly, my mother. And then so we'll not get to you first, Mum. We'll get to Uncle Biswa first. No, actually I'm going to ask Anita. Anita wrote the foreword to the book, a very glowing foreword to the book, but I wanted to ask you, if you could go beyond what you said in the foreword and sort of dig a little deeper. We have technically half an hour for this discussion. We could, because we're following the timetable. But they're extended depending on the enthusiasm of the audience as well as the panelists. Vidya's enthusiasm, because it's boundless, so we'll have to contain that one. Okay, so let's begin with you, Anita. Your general impressions of the book. You were given the manuscript and then you wrote the foreword.
Yeah, so when I got the manuscript, the first thing that the first thing that struck me was there was a little love story in there, right? A really mature love story between, her parents that she had weaved in, and I had not seen that wasn't foregrounded, or because I was told it's a story about my, Sanjay had gotten in touch with me, and then he said, oh, it's a story about my grandfather, and I was reading. It starts off by talking about and it starts off in Kerala actually. It sets the stage. It talks about a little bit about the Syrian Christian community, and that was interesting itself, And then it talks about this man who, comes here to Singapore, and it's a very honest depiction. I mean, I've read several biographies, right? And a lot of things are often whitewashed. I guess that's the nature of biographies. Quite a lot of things are, but I thought there were certain things where you were just starkly honest, and that made me love the characters more. That made me love you more, And I thought, oh, this is wonderful, because I get to see a very honest depiction. I get to see a person who's incredibly intelligent. I mean, he's the true linguist in the question, here, and he was clearly very competent, intelligent. And as the years go by, you see a really loving side to him. And how he interacts with the children, how he puts them first, how he, brings them together, gives them freedom and pulls them back. So there was so much that had, there was so much character, there was so much layering of the character. So all of that came through, and that was a pleasure to read. And I thought, so again, the first thing that has struck me was, how did she manage to pull all this off? I mean, when we start writing a short story, right? I mean, it's a biography, because a lot of it had to come from your own interpretation of things. You've got to have that, it's creative nonfiction to a large extent. And how did you envision all of this and create such a realistic character, and keeping it so true? I mean, I guess it's true, I don't know, but it didn't come off as someone who was trying to, not that you were trying to hide anything, So that was interesting. Then, I didn't want the book to end. I think I told you that. I was like, where's the next part? I want to know more. So those were my initial impressions.
There's so much I want to say about the book, but in the interest of time, I decided that I should try and write it, what I want to say about the book, in one paragraph. So this is what I have to say. It's a thoughtful and a very thoughtfully written, thought-provoking account of the life and times of an ordinary immigrant's extraordinary struggles. As a husband, as a father, as an intellectual, a patriot, and most importantly, with all the imperfections of being a human being. This, in spite of his exceptional talent and drive. The book also dutifully captures the vital role played by the wife. Sanjay, that was my favorite chapter as well. Especially in the challenging early post-war years. For those of us who lived through the 1930s to the 1960s and perhaps early 70s, the book brings an avalanche of memories. An avalanche. For those who are younger, I see a few of you, it gives reason for gratitude and humility. Books such as this are especially important in a fast-moving world ruled by social media with a constant and somewhat turbulent displacement of values. It provides some anchor and certainly context of who we are, where we come from, and what we ought to stand for in today's world. Therefore, there's great relevance. You have given relevance to history, to biography, to the power of the human spirit. I am grateful to you, Rosaly, for gifting this to us. We all should be grateful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Both of you. I can ask Anita to start with a very specific question for my mother. If something you want her to address, and that might be useful for a reader coming to this who might have no connection to this world, to this family, to the Malayali community, to, what would you ask my mother?
Well, that's a tough question, because
I ask this because I know that maybe you could address this. So I'll also ask the first question, which is, you struggle both with an attempt to document the life of your father, whose life wasn't documented in a consistent way, and then you also imagined conversations, didn't you? And that balance between historical fact and the imagined conversations. What were the challenges there? Where did you choose to insert those imagined conversations? And where were they tough? Where was it tough to to get into the minds of the characters, your father, your mother, and to depict them in a way that you felt you could stand by that characterization?
Well, it was difficult because I had no idea how they talked or what they did. I had to imagine all that.
Yeah. So what was challenging? Of all the imagined conversations in the book, like the one between your mother and the Kempetai officer, why did you put what you did into it?
When I asked my brother about it, he said the Japanese guy spoke good English. And my mother had learned to speak English. So I tried to make it as simple as possible. And it was easy.
Okay. Well, okay. So it was easy. Did you find any of the imagined conversations, Viswa, particularly interesting, or in terms of what they were? Because I noticed some of the thematics, right, in the imagined conversations to do with my grandfather's guilt about his son's rebellion. That seemed to be a running theme, right? And I wondered why that psychological, that part of my grandfather's psychological landscape was being foregrounded. What did you find in those conversations?
I had the same question actually. Rosaly, how did you manage to chronicle such a complex narrative? Because there are a lot of details. You went into a lot of details. What was worn, the syntax of the language. It's so the big challenge here is to what extent were they accurate? But then there's the big accuracy and the minute accuracy. And I think in a
the truth as opposed to historical fact.
Absolutely.
Right?
So I think as I was reading it, I was willing to forgive if there were minute details that one can dispute with. But the larger points that were being made were compelling. And I think one of the key things that, a motive, so to speak, right, that went right through was the evolution of this man, right, with all the imperfections which surfaced. For example, his interest later in life with stout.
Guinness stout.
With Guinness stout. He was a teetotaler, I believe, earlier on. Then the stresses made him drink, I don't think excessively, but not to the wife didn't quite like it, didn't quite approve, because there were daughters at home and so on. But you were not apologizing for the imperfections of this man. You celebrated the imperfections.
Right. Maybe this is a question that, beyond this book. How well did you know your father? How much did you interact? Was he a distant Asian father, or was he somebody that you got close to at some point in your life, in your interaction?
Yeah. From 1943, I knew my father. At least I knew there was this man who was very commanding in the house, and he used to play cards with us in the night, with my mother and my grandmother. And sometimes they asked me to join him to play.
And how old were you?
I should have been 6. I was 7, I think, 43, 44. And I used to play. So I knew my father, and he was always very kind. And he used to come and wake us up every morning. And everything I wrote, I remembered.
So 43, he dies in 56, isn't that? So you were already training to be a teacher, you'd come back and put about for his funeral. So as an adult, as you grew up, so you had your card gin rummy playing with your father. I think it's very good. I think all fathers should play gin rummy with their children.
Gin rummy or poker? I don't know what I play.
So it gets worse and worse. Okay, there's the Guinness and the gambling. It's just, but as you grow up, as you're a young woman, kind of discovering the world, and I know you love books. What were your interactions with him? Did you talk to him about books? Because you were an introspective girl, who loved her books and the world of books. And was that from your father, from your mother, and how did that work?
Well, to begin with, we were so many of us, and our ages differed. But my brother and my sister was 1 year difference, and me came after. So there were so many children, he couldn't interact with all of us. But he used to walk from the sitting room to the kitchen and back again, and that was his evening walk. We used to call him the walking dictionary. Because whenever we couldn't spell a word, we'll ask Dad, what's the word? And he would spell it out for us. We would do our schoolwork in the sitting room. And we had our desk and chairs there. But my mother had left for India somewhere in 53, I think, and she didn't come back for a year or so. So my father used to cook for us.
Which is quite exceptional. I mean, I'm thinking of what was the family structure then, you know, and you told me in the past, and this is not necessarily in the book, but that he was a man who understood what coming to the New World meant, what it meant for his children, the fact that you were allowed to sit with him rather than stand at attention, you know, when addressing him, that he allowed you to speak English to him, which is about a recognition of a world in transition, right, and the new realities.
So he insisted we all spoke English at home, and he used to reward us. I don't know what my sister said. He used to give us rewards for speaking in English. So though we spoke Malayalam to my mother, we always spoke English to my father and to each other.
Anita, can I ask Anita a question? I mean, when you read the book beyond the emotional portion, right, that you talk about the love that seems to, the quiet love, right, that is there sometimes of older tradition, the social context that my mother tried to invoke in the book, the references to the politics of the time, what were you sensing about this world? What did you sense about the milieu that is invoked in the book?
So there were two things that came through from that sense. One was, of course, how did people make sense of what was happening around them? I mean, we study history in school, we study these events, we know who, you know, what happened in terms of chronological order, but what did it mean to the layman on the street? So that came through, and it was extra special, of course, because it was from the Malayali community. So that was one aspect, I thought, of making sense of history, because history is not just what's written in the books, history is also how lives are lived by the common man on the street, right? So that was rather special and interesting, and I thought was really very value-added to the discussion. The second thing is that, you know, because in the beginning of the book, you talk about how the Syrian Catholic families is matrilineal, and that was news to me. So, you know, because I thought, and then the mother-in-law comes back to live with him, and I'm like, hey, what's happening? Can I have a dialogue here? What really happened, you know? So you could also see then, and picking up from what you said, Jared, you know, you could see then that these were practices from a different era, and then people moved, and how did they change as they moved? What happened between, you know, relationships and with customs and traditions? So there was this really nice transition, and even the silence on what happened between the mother-in-law and the son-in-law was quite telling, actually, because it didn't bother him anymore. Peter had changed, right?
Right. I'm going to invite questions from the audience very soon, but I want to ask Viswa this, because one of my favorite parts of the book, and actually in my mother's writing process, this emerged, was our search for photographs. And so page 74, there is a gallery of photographs, and some of them are quite unusual in that, if you see, there's a photograph of my grandfather, your father, P.C. Joseph, and my grandmother at my grandmother's funeral. And it is the priest, my grandparents, posing with the coffin, with the body, or an open casket of the mother-in-law. You spoke, Anita, just now about the mother-in-law. This is the mother-in-law. So you see her in the coffin. It's an unusual practice, and I don't know where it comes from, but I'm intrigued by it. Why did people of that period pose with the dead? You know, do you know, Mum, the rationale behind? Okay, this was in 1947, right? So you were about 11. So there's a lot of things that are, I think, were you all intrigued by the photographs?
No, I wasn't intrigued because I've seen similar photographs, and I don't know whether it's coincidental, but quite a few of the photographs were of Syrian Christian families. So it could be coincidental, but I have seen photographs like that.
No, I've seen too. Narayanan, Brahmin Patel family, as well as Vasu Srinivasan. I think that his father also had some. a similar photograph of the coffin, which was unusual, I understand, because from this era and time we've not seen these, but there have been photographs.
Yeah, I mean, they just posed. They just posed. I don't know why they posed. You know.
Yeah, but photographs in the 20th century are, go hand in hand. I mean, this is, in terms of depicting families, there's the posed studio. There's in fact the one of the connection with the story of the Japanese invasion, which is that the advanced team for the Japanese were in fact these photographers, right? They set up photographic studios across Malaya in order to do reconnaissance for the Imperial Army. And my grandfather had a relationship, right, with the photographer who took some of the early photographs. Are there questions from the audience, if you'd like to ask? Sandeep, well-known published author himself.
Now, I have more of a comment, and I'm going to respond to the reading that we heard at the beginning of the program.
Sorry, hello. It's more of a comment, and I'm going to respond to the reading that we heard at the beginning of the program. Now, I teach history. Every year, I load up a bus of students, and we go to the Ford Motor Factory. And we go to that surrender room, and there you have the clock frozen at 6:20, and you have that table and that scene. And though in our history training, we've seen that footage of Yamashita during the surrender. It's silent footage, and he seems very agitated. And some people said, no, maybe it's sped up, but no, he was agitated. And the only explanation we ever heard of that was he was exasperated at the interpreter. That's all we ever knew, right? Because the interpreter couldn't keep up. This is what generations have learned about this. So to hear that there was actually a person sitting there debating between unequivocal and unconditional in one of the most momentous moments in the last century of Singapore's history, that just adds a whole level of detail. And it's a great service to sort of the historical record of that time. I don't think people know this. I mean, I've never heard of this before. And it changes everything. And it goes to that sort of smaller history of moments, which is usually glossed over by these big events. I just wanted to mention that.
Very much.
It's an excellent point, because that particular point struck me as well, and also it points to the meticulous nature of this man, and his mathematics background. When a mathematician becomes a linguist, you have an explosion or perhaps an implosion, and it's very cathartic because of the sheer power of his intellect. I mean, how many of us would actually, I was reading it and smiling, I recall, how many of us would actually spend hours pondering whether I should have used the word unconditionally or unequivocally? How many of us would do that? And what really is the difference between the two? One would ask. But that strikes at the foundation of this man. And what I would call his identity crisis. I mean, I sensed that he was struggling with who am I, right through. He started off as a Syrian Christian coming to Singapore, from Kerala, from Kochi, right? Who studied in Madras University, came to Singapore and learned several languages, but still retained the English language as the primary. Then there was a question of, am I an Anglophile? I mean, those things came through. And these are struggles that all of us go through, right? Migrant communities that we go through that at some point, because many of us have forgotten our vernacular over time. But we call ourselves Malayalis, Tamilians, and so on, but we've forgotten that. We've become so anglicized. So for me, those were the things that struck me, And thanks for bringing this up, because this is also part of the tension that the man was going through.
I
It's a remarkable historical detail also. That
It's people's history.
I don't think people know of that moment, you know. Thank you.
Where did you get that detail from? For people who haven't read the book and would like to get a sense of, is that imagined or is that history?
Imagined. I have no idea actually. Well, I read about the surrender scene. I know there was some kind of agitation, as you say, Yamashita, but there was nothing else. So I thought, if he was the interpreter and he was asked to interpret the word that would, if you read history, you will be conscious of the word unconditional. What did Percival mean by unconditional? So I thought I would use that, and I said, if the Japanese word for unconditional, and I checked it up, and it said a different word. So I thought I'll use that, and that's how it started.
I know, sorry. Please. Sorry.
Hi, Rosalie. Great to be here. Ken Hickson by name. I've already talked to Rosalie about this book and other things she's done in the past. I've done my best to review things as well. But what is very interesting, I'm so pleased you decided to take this particular approach with this book, because we've all written, and many of us have written, and certainly read, thousands of books that go out of their way to keep to the pure historical facts. But it's so good that you've decided to fill in a lot more. And this is where I suppose your book sort of is somewhere in between historical fiction and non-fiction, because you've invented and drawn on, obviously, experiences and memories of different members of your family to really fill in more. And these days, when we are confronted by fake news and false interpretations and social media that gives us all sorts of rubbish, you've decided to put on paper, as a historical record, your understanding and your interpretation and your observations, as well as the collection of views of other people. And to me, this does more than a book of history or a non-fiction account, because you've filled in some of the colour and atmosphere, if you like, that we often miss when we read history. I think as the previous speaker made that point, that you've filled in an essential part of Singapore's history, Malaysia's history, by doing this, and I think you've done a great service. So that's my comment. My question is, and I know I'm not sure whether you want to answer a question like this, is what are you working on now? What more can we get from you?
At the moment, I'm not doing anything, because I think I'm not that well. I hope to do something, but it will be about myself. That's all I can say.
So she has an autobiography, a semi-autobiography, fictional autobiography, Tessellated Path, right? It's a kind of fictionalized autobiographical novel, right? But anchored in your life, very much. And that's right, Tessellated Path. Man, do you carry the collection with you? Yeah. There's also a wartime memoir, which is, what was it called? Your wartime memoir, which is
Under the Shadow.
So that's also an account of the family, but fictionalized, no? Isn't it?
It's not fictionalized, it is my memory of those years, where there is certain areas that must be fictionalized. I mean, as I remember, I wrote as I remember. But how far it's true to life, I don't know.
So this is the other thing, and it's a clue into the Puthucheary family dynamic, which is that they all believe themselves to be historians, amateur historians, and purveyors of the historical truth. And so family dinners are often full of disputes about what happened, where it happened, who it happened to, which makes Christmas a thing I look forward to every year. And I must say, we don't lack discussion in the Puthucheary family. Anita, do you have things that you think you'd like readers to pay attention to in the book?
Can I ask a question first? Yes. Could you tell us more about your writing process? You published a fabel.
My writing program, meaning what I wrote?
A process.
How do you start? Do you have rituals?
No rituals. I think about what I'm going to write, and I write. That's it. But sometimes, like in this book, Hinduism is something I didn't know about. So I remember the name Mukrichi. My father brought him to dinner in our house. So I knew he spoke. He had a friend. But I thought, what conversation can we have? So I thought, what about Hinduism, So I wrote about, but before I wrote about Hinduism, I read a book on Hinduism, Imperial series, and it gave me a gist of what Hinduism is about, so I wrote about it.
It was a very detailed section, I remember reading that.
And I always checked all the facts that I wrote. I never invented facts, but I invented the conversations.
So one of the things, just to pull on the process was your concern about in the chronology of Dad's professional career, right? And I remember you asked for everybody's birth certificates, your siblings' certificates, because that would be a record of what the father did. The father's occupation would be listed. So, and I think one of the real challenges for anybody trying to recover or reconstruct a family history is, where do you go when you're not in the public eye and there's no media reports on the things you do? How do you reconstruct it beyond the memories? And so church records is a place you might go to and such, right?
Yeah. That was very interesting in our house because all the daughters of the family had no names on their birth certificate. So I asked my mother, why were there no names? So she said, oh, Dad was in a hurry. So I said, if
Dad was in a hurry.
So...
And you couldn't remember the names.
No.
Went to the register.
No. That's not how it happened. It happened that my sister was asked to give us a name. So we did not go for biblical names, but she took my sister, first sister is Daisy. So the next one, me, Rosaly. And then the third sister was called Lily. And the fourth was called Suzette. And all under names of flowers. And my father, when he said he was always in a rush, and so when he got to the register, he couldn't remember which flower was it. So he left it all blank. And later, when we went the O-level, he went and made declaration. So we have a declaration with our birth certificate saying, this is Rosaly Puthucheary and so on. And that's how our name from Puthucheary became Puthucheary.
Another intriguing fact, we're talking about writing, is that during COVID, my mother published another book. This was actually the second of the two books over the pandemic. The first one being a literary analysis of pre-independent Singaporean poetry in English. So Rosie's been very busy, and it's interesting that you asked Ken what she's doing next, because I don't believe for a moment that there isn't a next, you know. Yes, sir. What else would you like audiences to be attentive to? Some people have bought the book, they're still available, don't rush right now, or to get them autographed. What would you like people to be attentive to?
You know, for me, chapter 7, titled House Near the Prison. Right. I saw that as a metaphor of what he was going through. In many ways, he felt, this is my reading of it, I could see that here is a man who was struggling with himself. Who am I? I'm trapped here in tradition. Earlier on, he talks about how he was glad to pull away from the tradition, the traditional customs and so on, where he seemed to perceive that he lost his manhood. He would have continued to lose his manhood because the man in the Syrian Christian tradition didn't have very much of a say. It was matrilineal, right? So that was very strong. I mean, for a man to feel that he's losing his manhood, then he came here and he asserted it, right? Yet there were also political and intellectual clashes. For me, the strongest point that came through, and not in so many words, was that, and it's a struggle that many fathers go through, you know, trying to strike a balance between our own emotional and intellectual persuasions, right? It's quite often libertarian persuasions, and being a responsible father to 10 children, providing for them. Sometimes you have to make compromises. I could see this man struggling in having to make those compromises, those trade-offs, to be a good father, to provide for the family, but then he struggled with it, right? So the chapter 7 about the prison, the reference to the prison for me was a very powerful metaphor. But what is even more important is the way the book ended. And so this is you know, Rosaly, you talked about, it's so picturesque, the way you described your father on a few occasions, pacing up and down the house, saying mea culpa, which we know in Latin means I'm guilty, right? I'm culpable, mea culpa, right? Now, it's a culmination of the struggles that I've talked about, the trade-off, you know. I think it is powerful that it's very, very likely that he felt responsible for your eldest brother, James, right? The path he took, joining the INA, the Indian National Army, going to India, right? Coming back to Singapore, and then being restless, politically restless. We all know that your two brothers, right, were detained in Operation Cold Store in 1963. James and Dominic, right? They were detained under Operation Cold Store in 1963, and both were exiled in Malaysia, right? So I'm sure your father would have felt the fact that he kept saying mea culpa, mea culpa. It was coming to terms with a deep sense of guilt that I could have been inadvertently responsible for the path that James took, and subsequently Dominic.
Was, you know, mea culpa is also part of the Latin liturgy, right? It's the priest, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, right? Isn't that from, did you take it from there? Was it something, was your father deeply religious? Was he Roman Catholic?
But he used to say these words, you know. So sorry, what is it?
So you used to say that, so these were common.
I mean, I wondered why he kept saying mea culpa. I'm guilty. He used to walk up and down, and I think he was thinking all the time. But that's what I think, you know. I'm not sure whether he did or not, but I thought it would be a nice way to end the story. And I used that.
I'm going to ask, is there any other questions on the floor? Because we're running out of time, aren't we? In terms of Are there any questions?
If you don't mind,
yeah,
I would like to read the last part to do justice to the book, if you don't mind, with your permission. This Dear Kalpa part and the way you ended was extremely powerful, I thought. Rosalind was taken to the hospital to see her father.
Page.
Oh, sorry, page 143, in the middle. Okay? Rosalind was taken to the hospital to see her father. Standing next to the bed where Joseph was in a coma, she thought, is this what life is about? All of us must be prepared to die one day. In her ears, she could hear the words of her father used to utter as he walked in the house in Muhammad Talib in 1952, when James was first detained, saying, mea culpa. He seems to have accepted his guilt in playing a role in making James a liberator for the formal acknowledgement that it was his personal fault for leaving the 5-year-old with his mother in India in 1927. But Rosalind thought, was he really guilty for making James a liberator? Hasn't he got any right to live his life as he wishes? What is a father's duty? Is the father a provider and the mainstay of the family? Can the father be responsible for the actions of his children? Is the father the king of the family? Can he control the behavior of the children? Will there be chaos in society if the father does not do his duty? Then she ends it by saying, Joseph passed away on the 13th of May 1956. At the funeral, a crowd of men from different walks of life came to pay their respects. One of them came up to Rosalind and said, I will be most grateful to your father all my life. What I have today, I owe to him. According to this person, every man who had come to pay respects were given free lodging and food in Joseph's house when they first arrived from India. Rosalind looked at them. All of them were Indians. Some of them were Hindus, others were Muslims, but most of them were Christians. To Joseph, they were all fellow Indians who spoke different languages and prayed in different ways to all embracing, all-pervading, omnipresent God. Joseph accepted the omniscience and omnipotence of God, but also his omnipresence. It is this recognition of many paths that lead to the one and the same God, which gave Joseph a sense of doing good. I thought that this was your way of liberating your father.
Very interesting, thank you. Mom, do you want to respond to that? It's the last words.
Yes, I mean, that actually happened. With my father's funeral, a man did come. It brings my memories.
Actually, my aunt said that in reading this book, it triggered a lot of memories, and these are very deep memories. Okay, I think we've probably come to the end of the panel. I think on that note, thank you so much, Viswa and Anita, for both reading the book so carefully and being such champions of it. And thank you for being with us and sharing your thoughts and tears. It's all good. And I'm going to hand this back over to Vidya, who's going to, she's going to wrap this afternoon's proceedings up in a succinct way, just very quick.
I'd like to say a big thank you to Rosalie. Can you join me, please?
Yes, thank you. That was a very great discussion. I learned so much from it, and it just makes me want to read it. Like, I wanted to read it while this was going on because it was just so interesting. So thank you very much for discussing that in great detail. Okay, so that is the end of the discussion, and I do want to thank the Mr. Ulas, who's that guy over there, because he organized this entire event, and it was such a great event. So thank you very much, and the Singapore Malayali Association as well for organizing the event. And so now that we've finished, we will move on to book signing. Not to put pressure, I don't know if that's it, but that you can get your books autographed. And then there's definitely tea, so that's pretty refreshing. So there's refreshments, and then we'll just, this is the end, so we just mingle, talk. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, everybody.